Hey class, hey, just wanted to upload a quick video on what you're going to see here in chapter 5. We're going to be dealing again with inventory here in this chapter, but we're going to talk about inventory cost flow methods. And this really just comes down to how we track inventory in terms of valuation. I think for the most part, you're going to find this chapter not too difficult as long as you take a little time with it. But basically, we're going to talk about 3 different methods of inventory cost flow. One of them is what we call first in, first out. Also, something else we call the opposite of first in, first out, which is last in, first out. These 2 terms are commonly referred to as FIFO and LIFO, so you'll see those terms in there. And then the other one is weighted average cost method, which is more an average between the 2. So when we talk about inventory, really first in, first out just assumes that the oldest inventory is sold first. So if you kind of think of putting inventory into like buckets, the first inventory to be sold would be then out of the bottom of the bucket because those are oldest inventory or the first ones put in there. LIFO, last in, first out, would be just the opposite, but the assumption would be that we pull the inventory out of the top of the bucket. And of course, weighted average is in the middle. The reason why we do this is because we can't always use specific identification method. We can't always, with companies that have large amounts of inventory, can't always specifically identify every item that leaves their store shelves. So what we do is we just make certain assumptions about how those items leave the store shelves. And the other thing that we can't do is we can't control consumer behavior. I mean, you think of all kinds of examples of this. Like, for instance, if you go to the grocery store, like when you go to buy milk at the grocery store, you open the freezer door or the fridge door and the store always puts the oldest expiration milk, up in front, right? Just hoping that you'll just grab it and put it in your cart. Of course, people are kind of wise to that. So a lot of people, what do? They kind of take and they spread it out and they reach in the back and they grab the freshest milk out of the back. We can't control consumer behavior. And so what we do in situations like that is we just make assumptions about how inventory leaves the store shelves. So FIFO method in a grocery store would probably be the most likely method that a grocery store can use. But really, any of these methods are acceptable under GAAP. So they can use any one of these as long as they're consistent from one period to the next. They can use any one. So in this chapter, this is all about just kind of learning about these 3 methods and understanding how they work. Now, in terms of the problems and how they're set up, just really quickly, I'm not going to go through a detailed example here. I think you'll see that in the journal. There's some completed examples in there, and I think you'll probably figure these out. But I do want you to make sure that you're reading these instructions carefully in these journals because I talk a little bit about how these problems are structured, and there's kind of 2 different ways that you'll experience these problems. One way, which you'll see in the first example in the journal, is where you have, say, a beginning inventory amount, and then you'll have a series of purchases, say, throughout the month, and then you'll have one big sale at the end. When you have a problem that's structured like this, it's pretty easy to solve it. Really, it's just a matter of kind of just counting up depending on the method you're using. So for instance, there's a completed example you'll see in the journal for first in, first out. It's kind of saying, well, which items are you assuming you're selling first? Well, if you're, using first in, first out, FIFO, you're always going to sell the oldest items first. So you kind of think of, again, as this inventory kind of in different buckets as the purchases happened. So you'd sell the first items or the oldest items first, and once those are gone, you go to the next and the next and the next, kind of work your way until you finally get to the sale at the end of the month. And you'll notice that I have a chart here to kind of help you, work this through. And I think charts like this really do help you. You don't have to use a chart, but it really will help you get to the right answer at the end. And just always realize that they can ask you any number of things like what's your cost of goods sold, what's your ending inventory. So make sure to take a close look at these completed examples. You'll see how they work. Of course, LIFO is just the opposite of FIFO, meaning that the most recent inventory is assumed to be sold first. All right, and then weighted average is in the middle. So you'll see examples of that in each one. Now, the other way these problems can be created or set up is probably a little more realistic, where you have a situation like this, where you have a beginning inventory amount, and then you have purchases and then sales, and purchases and sales kind of mixed or intermixed throughout the period, say a month. Now, in this type of problem, you're still going to do the same thing, for instance, like if you were using a FIFO methodology, but you're going to have to take a little bit more care in the chart that you create. You're going to have to kind of track it more kind of step by step. I think this will make sense when you start going through it. In other words, you can't just count up or count down. These are a little bit harder to kind of manage because you're kind of tracking the inventory as you progress through the month. So I just really wanted to stress to make sure that you take a really close look at those completed examples before you try it on your own. I think once you get it, it's one of these chapters where kind of once you get it, it'll just kind of make sense and it'll just snap together and you'll have it. So anyway, if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. Good luck.